The distress beacon came in at 0340 hours, deep in the off-cycle, when most of the crew was either asleep or running minimal attention monitoring shifts. It was a standard Colony Transit Authority frequency, the kind used by civilian freight and passenger vessels. And the signal was damaged and skipping in and out, but the core message was clear enough. The freighter Ardenna had been ambushed in the outer Velhari expanse by Vreth pirate vessels. It had taken hull damage on 3 decks. Its engines were running at less than a quarter capacity. It could not run, and it could not hide, and it was asking anyone who could hear the signal to please respond. Morrow was on the monitoring shift when it came through. She had the beacon triangulated and the Ardenna's position plotted on the nav display before the second echo of the signal had finished. She opened the duty channel, and her voice was flat and immediate. "Commander to the bridge." Vrathson arrived in under 2 minutes, still pulling his duty jacket straight. He looked at the display, read the signal data, and said nothing for a moment. Then he opened the long-range scan and let it run. The scan came back with the Vreth fleet configuration, 9 vessels, spread in a containment pattern around the Ardenna's position. Heavy-class raiders, 3 of them, with 6 lighter pursuit ships forming the outer ring. The Ardenna sat in the middle, like something caught in a net. It was not moving. "What is our response window?" Vrathson asked. 40 minutes to intercept at full burn, Morrow said. "After that, the Ardenna's hull integrity readings suggest we are looking at a boarding breach or a hull collapse. Either way, 40 minutes is the outside limit." "What is the next nearest coalition vessel?" 4 hours out, Morrow said. "I already checked." Vrathson looked at the enemy fleet configuration again. 9 vessels against Outpost Velar 9's single patrol cruiser. The numbers were not a puzzle. They were a wall. Coalition tactical doctrine had a clear answer for walls. You did not run at them alone. You withdrew, you reported, you waited for reinforcement. He opened the command channel to Coalition Command and filed an emergency contact request. While it was processing, he pulled up the Ardenna's transit manifest, standard procedure for any distress response assessment, and put it on the main screen so he could check what the vessel was carrying. He needed to know if there were restricted materials or government assets aboard that might change the tactical calculus. The manifest loaded. He read the first line and stopped. Morrow had already seen it. She had pulled the manifest 2 minutes before she called him to the bridge, and she was watching him read it, the same way she had watched Osei's face in the equipment bay when Gumtar had asked his question. Not pushing, not performing, just waiting. The Ardenna was a colony resettlement transport. It was carrying 812 civilian passengers. 219 of them were listed in the manifest as dependent minors, children, in transit with their families to a new settlement in the outer territories. There were no government assets, no restricted materials, no tactical designation of any kind. It was just a ship full of people, going somewhere new, who had run into something they had no way to fight. Command came back on the channel with a response to the emergency contact request. They had the Ardenna's position, they had the fleet configuration data Morrow had transmitted, and their recommendation was a tactical withdrawal pending reinforcement. The order was formally, correctly, defensively worded. It was, by every standard measurement, the right call. Vrathson acknowledged receipt of the recommendation. Then he looked at the manifest on the screen. 812 names, 219 of them children, and he did not speak for a moment. Behind him the bridge door opened. Gumtar came through it, in full combat kit, and took his station without being asked or ordered. He had heard the duty channel from his bunk, and had suited up before he was even fully awake. He looked at the manifest on the screen, and then looked at Vrathson, and said nothing. Silath came through the door 30 seconds behind him, with Orendal right behind her. Then the Daki engineers filed in, Scath 4 first, the rest of the cluster behind her. Then the remaining Kreth soldiers, moving in the fast, quiet way Kreth soldiers moved, when they had already made a decision and were done deliberating. And finally Kask, youngest and quietest, who went straight to his secondary weapons console and started running the targeting calibration without making eye contact with anyone. The bridge was full. Every crew member was at a station. Nobody had been ordered there. Vrath-San looked at his crew, at the Voss and the Luminari, and the Daki, and his own Kret soldiers, and the 3 humans, Moro still at the nav station, Osei at communications, Kask at the weapons board, and he understood, in a way that went past words, what had just happened. They had looked at the manifest, and they had made their choice. The same choice, all of them, without a meeting, or a vote, or a speech. They had simply walked to their stations. He opened the comm to command. "We are engaging," he said. The battle was brutal. The Vreth raiders were experienced, and they were not surprised. A coalition patrol cruiser burning hard toward their position at full speed was not subtle, and they moved to intercept with the kind of practiced coordination that came from years of running operations in contested space. The 3 heavy-class ships pushed forward to form a blocking line, while the 6 pursuit vessels split and came in from the flanks, trying to put Valar 9's cruiser in the same kind of net they had used on the Ardenna. But Vrath-San had 42 years of command, and Siloth was possibly the finest navigator in the sector, and the Dahaki engineers pushed the ship's systems to outputs that were technically past rated capacity, and did not blink about it. The cruiser came in at an angle that broke the blocking formation before it fully set, took 2 hard hits to the forward shields that made the deck shudder and the lights drop for 3 seconds, and drove straight through the gap. Guntar ran the weapon systems like a man who had been waiting for exactly this fight. The pursuit vessels came around for a second pass, and found that a Voss warrior at a weapons console, running on the particular focused clarity that comes when the numbers are bad and the choice has already been made, was not something they had calibrated for. 2 of the 6 pursuit ships broke off after the first exchange. The other 4 stayed, and the fight got close and loud and very ugly for a stretch of time that Kask would later describe, to anyone who asked, simply as long. The Ardenna's boarding breach alert went live at the 28-minute mark. Vreth raiders were cutting through the lower cargo deck. Vrath-San drove the cruiser into a firing position that put 2 of the remaining enemy vessels between his guns and a hard choice. And Guntar made the choice without being asked, and the breach stopped. The last Vreth vessel disengaged at the 39th minute and ran. The bridge was silent, except for damage alerts and the sound of people breathing. Morrow ran the crew status check. 3 injuries, none critical. Kask had a cut across his forearm from a console fragment, and had wrapped it himself without stopping. Oren Dahl had taken a pressure concussion from a shockwave, and was sitting on the deck next to his station, looking carefully at the ceiling. Guntar had a deep bruise across 2 of his forearms from a systems panel that had blown out against him, and he was already dismissing it. The Ardenna's comm came live. The captain, voice cracked with relief and something close to disbelief, saying words that mostly ran together. And Morrow responded in the steady, professional tone of someone who had simply done a job and was now moving to the next one. In the docking bay, an hour later, as the Ardenna's passengers came through the transfer lock in a slow, careful stream. Families with bundles, and children half asleep on shoulders, and old people moving with the careful steps of those who understood exactly what had almost happened. Vrath-San found Morrow sitting on a cargo crate near the wall, her helmet off, her hands loose in her lap, watching the people come through. He sat down beside her. The bay was loud, with voices and footsteps, and the sound of children being told they were safe now. But between the 2 of them, there was a quiet that had its own particular weight. After a long moment, Vrath-San said, "Now I understand why you tell the stories." Morrow nodded slowly. She was watching a small girl, maybe 5 or 6 years old, who had fallen asleep against her mother's shoulder, and was clutching a cloth toy with both hands, completely unaware of anything that had happened in the last 2 hours. "So we remember," Morrow said. "So everyone does." Vrath-san said nothing more. He sat beside her and watched the people come through, and the docking bay filled with the noise of the living. And outside the hull, the Velhari expanse stretched on in every direction, vast and cold and full of everything that could go wrong, and full, too, of whatever it was that had walked onto this bridge tonight, and stood at every station without being asked. He had spent 42 years among the stars, and had not yet found a word for it in any language he knew. But he knew now, sitting in the noise and the warmth of a bay full of people who did not know his name, that it was real, that it had always been real, and that the stories had never been myths at all. They had been instructions, left by people who knew what was coming, for people who would have to decide what to do when it arrived. And the deciding, in the end, was always the same. Someone looks at what needs to be done, and they look at themselves, and they choose. All that had always been all. And somehow, against every number, and every model, and every reasonable calculation, it was always enough. Nobody expected the assembly. The alert came through on a standard crew channel at the start of the morning shift. All personnel to the main briefing room at second bell. Attendance mandatory. No mission classification attached. And it was the lack of classification that made everyone uncomfortable. A classified assembly meant a threat or a new order. An unclassified assembly meant something else entirely. And on a military outpost, something else entirely almost never meant good news. They filed in over the course of 10 minutes. The Kretz soldiers first, precise and early, taking the left side of the room in formation. The Voss coming in behind them in a loose group, Goomtar at the front. The Luminari drifting in quietly, Silath and Orendal side by side. The Dahaki cluster arranging themselves near the back wall. And the humans last, Morrow, Ose, and Kask, who found seats without ceremony, and waited with the calm patience that the rest of the crew had begun, over the past week, to look at differently. Vrath-san stood at the front of the room. He was in his full command uniform, not the duty fatigues he wore for most shifts, but the formal gray and black of a Kreth senior officer, and he stood without moving while the room filled, his amber eyes tracking the crew as they settled. When the last person was seated, he waited one more moment before he spoke. "I called this assembly to correct something I did," he said. His voice was level and carried the quiet authority of someone who had spent 40 years being listened to. "And I want everyone present when I do it." He looked directly at Sergeant Morrow. 7 days ago, in the Common Bay, you shared stories from your people's history. They were true stories. I knew they were true stories when you told them, and I said nothing, while my crew laughed at them. That was wrong of me, and I am sorry for it. The room was very still. Morrow looked at him without expression. "You don't owe me anything, Commander." "That is not accurate," he said, "but we will come back to that." He turned to face the full room. When he spoke again, the formality in his voice had shifted into something more plainly personal. Not softer exactly, but stripped of its official layer. The way a blade looks different when you take it out of its case. "I have served in the Galactic Coalition for 42 years, he said. "And 12 of those years were spent embedded with human military units during the border conflict campaigns. I was attached to them as a coalition observer and advisor. What that means practically is that I went where they went and I watched what they did. I want to tell you about one thing I watched. No one moved. In the 41st month of the border campaigns, there was a station called Callaway, a relay and transit post on the edge of the Sethian corridor. When the Vreth Raider fleets pushed through the northern lines, Callaway was directly in their path. The coalition had already begun evacuating the civilian population from the sector behind it. 800 people, mostly families of station workers, including a large number of children. But the evacuation transports were 12 hours out. Calloway needed to hold for 12 hours, or the evacuation corridor would be cut, and those 800 people would have nowhere to go. He stopped for a moment, not from difficulty, but because the next part required a certain precision. The station garrison had already been reduced to support the northern defense push. What remained at Calloway, when the Vreth advance force arrived, was a single human fire team of 6 soldiers. They had a standard loadout, a partially damaged perimeter defense grid, and a comm system that was working at about 40% capacity. The Vreth advance force numbered over 400. Goom Tar made a sound. Not a laugh, nothing like a laugh, but the involuntary intake of breath that comes when a number lands harder than expected. Coalition Command contacted the fire team leader and authorized an immediate tactical withdrawal. Vrathsan continued. The order was correct. It was the right tactical decision. 6 soldiers could not hold that station, and everyone knew it. The fire team leader acknowledged the authorization, confirmed receipt of the order, and then told command that they would not be withdrawing. He let that sit in the room for a moment. They held Calloway Station for 19 hours, he said. 7 more than the evacuation needed. I do not know why they stayed that extra 7 hours. Perhaps the fighting made the time hard to track. Perhaps they simply kept going because stopping felt worse than continuing. I was not inside the station. I was on the perimeter with the Coalition Liaison Unit watching the sensor data. What I can tell you is that each of those 6 humans died inside that station. The last one, her name was Corporal Desta Haley. She was 24 years old, was recovered near the main entrance corridor. She had taken 3 separate hits during the engagement. The medical report said any one of the 3 should have ended the fight for her. The sensor data showed she had been firing her weapon in the last recorded minutes. The evacuation convoy had cleared the corridor 6 hours before she stopped. The briefing room was completely silent. Vrathsan looked at his crew, at the Voss warrior who had laughed the loudest, at the Luminari who had run the archive numbers, at the Dahaki who had told him privately the previous morning what their probability model had found. And his voice, when he continued, was the quietest it had been. I came back to the outpost that night, and I wrote my field report, and I filed it correctly and completely, and I never talked about it. I am a Kref soldier. We do not speak about things that exceed our ability to explain them. But I have thought about Calloway Station every year since, and I know what Sergeant Morrow's stories are, and I should have said so in the Common Bay, instead of letting my silence become permission for something it should not have been. He looked at Morrow again. The stories are not entertainment, they are not mythology, and they are not pride, and they are not the exaggerations of a young species trying to make itself feel larger than it is. They are a record that your people keep for yourselves, a record that says, this is what we are capable of choosing. This is what people like us have done. Do not forget that when the moment comes, you are also a person like that. That is what the stories are for. Morrow held his gaze. Something passed across her face. Not emotion exactly, more like the recognition of something seen clearly for the first time by someone else. That is exactly what they are for, she said. Vrathsan nodded once, a short, deliberate Kreth gesture that meant something close to, I see you, and I will not look away again. Then he dismissed the assembly. The crew filed out in the kind of quiet that is not uncomfortable, but is very full. Goom Tar passed Ose in the doorway, and paused, and said nothing, but put one large hand briefly on the human soldier's shoulder, before moving on. Siloth looked at Kask as she passed him, and Kask, the youngest of the 3 humans, the quietest, gave her a small nod that seemed to carry more weight than any of the words that had just been spoken. And Vrathsan stood at the front of the empty room for a moment, after everyone had gone, still and straight in his formal uniform, looking at the place where 6 names he would never forget had just been spoken aloud for the first time in 42 years. Word moved quietly. the way it always does on a small outpost, where there is nowhere to go and nothing to do during off-cycles except talk. Silath had not meant to say anything. She had gone back to her navigation work and told herself the archive data was interesting, but not urgent. But then she had passed Orendal in the corridor, and he had mentioned it to the junior luminary technician on the next shift, who had said something to the Daki engineer, Scath 4, during a system calibration. And Scath 4 had done what Daki engineers always did when presented with a data problem. She had immediately told her entire cluster. Within 4 days, every non-human crew member on Outpost Valar 9 had heard something. Not the full picture, not yet, but enough. Enough to make people quieter in the corridors when the 3 human soldiers passed. Enough to make Goom-Tar stop mid-sentence during a meal briefing and stare at Corporal Osei for just a moment too long before looking away. The humans noticed, Morrow especially, because Morrow noticed everything, but they said nothing about it. They had learned long ago that the best response to being watched was to keep moving as if you had not seen the watching. It was Goom-Tar who finally broke. He found Osei alone in the equipment bay on the 5th day, running checks on the suit locker inventory. A boring task that Osei performed with the same cheerful patience he brought to everything. And he stood in the doorway for a moment before stepping inside. "I have a question," Goom-Tar said. Osei looked up, unhurried. "Ask it." The Voss warrior was not a small creature. He stood nearly 2.5 meters tall, built like something designed specifically to move through a wall rather than around it. And he had fought in 6 campaigns and received decorations in 4 of them. He was not someone who found questions difficult to ask. But he stood in the equipment bay doorway and was quiet for longer than Osei expected before the words came out. "The stories your sergeant told, the ones about soldiers who stayed in a fight they could not win, I want to understand why they did not leave. In Voss doctrine, when a position is lost, the unit withdraws and regroups and fights from a better ground. This is not cowardice. This is strategy. It keeps soldiers alive to fight again. A dead soldier is worth nothing to the unit, nothing to the mission, nothing to the people you are protecting. So why did your soldiers stay?" Osei set down the inventory scanner and thought about it. Genuinely, not performing consideration, but actually thinking. His brow pulled together slightly, and he looked at the middle distance for a moment. "Because someone had to," he said. Goom-Tar waited for more. When no more came, he said, "That is not a reason, that is a description." "I know," Osei said, "but for us, it is also a reason. When there is something that has to be done, and nobody else is there to do it, and you know that, you really know it, not as an idea, but as a fact standing in front of you, then the question of whether you personally should leave gets a lot harder to answer. Because leaving means it does not get done. And if it does not get done, someone else pays the price, someone who is not there, someone who had no choice in the matter. And we do not deal well with that." Goom-Tar was quiet for a moment. "Do not deal well with it how?" "We remember it," Osei said simply. For a very long time. The Voss warrior left the equipment bay without saying much more, and Osei went back to his inventory, and neither of them made it into a larger moment than it was, but Goom-Tar spent the rest of his shift thinking about the answer in a way he could not quite set aside. In the engineering section, meanwhile, the Daki had moved past curiosity and into calculation. Scath 4 and her cluster had pulled the same archive data Silath had found, and run it through a predictive framework the Daki used for structural probability assessments. A model normally used to calculate how long a given material would hold under stress before failing. They had adapted it to the human behavioral data and asked it a simple question. Given standard survival instinct parameters, what was the statistical probability of a species producing the documented human pattern of voluntary combat sacrifice at the frequency the archive recorded? The model had run the numbers 3 times because the first 2 outputs looked like errors. The probability was so close to 0 that the model flagged it as a null result. Not impossible, technically, but so far outside the expected range for any known species that the framework had no category for it. Scath4 had annotated the result with a single line in Docky technical notation that translated roughly into something like, "The data is internally consistent, but the behavior it describes should not exist." She shared the result with Silath, who read it twice and said nothing. She shared it with Orendal, who read it and then immediately went and found something else to do. She had not yet shared it with Vrathsan, partly because the Kreth commander had not asked, and partly because Scath4 had the strong instinct, common to all Docky, that some information was better delivered in person and in the right moment, rather than dropped into a data feed. But she had noticed something about Vrathsan that she had filed away without fully examining. Since the night of the storytelling gathering, the commander had spent more time in his private quarters than usual. He had not reduced his duty hours, had not skipped any briefings, had not failed any of his command responsibilities. But in the off-cycle hours, when most of the crew found the common bay or the mess hall, he was gone. And when Scath4 had passed his quarters door once and heard the faint audio output from a personal terminal, she had recognized the cadence of archive playback. The same archive she had been pulling from herself. She had not stopped, she had not knocked, she had walked on. But she had wondered, with the particular precise wonder of a Dahi mind, what exactly the Kreth commander was watching, and how long he had been watching it, and whether the expression on his face behind that closed door looked anything like the expression she had seen, very briefly, on his face the night the humans had closed their datapad and walked quietly out of the room. 2 days passed without anyone bringing up the human stories again. The mission continued as it always did. Patrol checks, system sweeps, equipment calibrations, shift rotations, and the crew moved through their routines with the quiet efficiency of people who had been doing the same job long enough that it required very little thought. The humans worked their shifts, ate in the mess hall, nodded to their alien crewmates in the corridors, and gave no sign that anything in the common bay that evening had bothered them in the slightest. But Silath could not stop thinking about it. She was a luminary navigator, pale-skinned and faintly luminous, with large silver eyes that could process star charts faster than any computer on the ship. And she was, by nature and by training, someone who needed things to make sense. When something did not make sense, she did not laugh at it and move on. She turned it over and over in her mind, like a stone she had found on a strange shore, looking at every surface, checking every angle, until she understood what it was. The human stories did not make sense, not in the way Gumtar meant when he laughed, not "this is exaggerated nonsense," but in a deeper way, in the way a mathematical equation that should not balance and yet somehow does. There was something underneath those stories that bothered her, and 2 days of ignoring it had only made it louder. On the 3rd morning after the Common Bay gathering, during her off-cycle hours, Silath went to the outpost library deck. The library deck was always empty at that hour. It was a small room with 6 terminal stations, and walls lined with archived data across every language spoken by every coalition member species. She sat at the far terminal, pulled up the Galactic Historical Archive, and entered a search parameter for human military history. Verified records only, she specified. Primary sources where available. No secondary interpretations. The archive returned over 4 million documents. She sat for a moment, looking at the number. Then she narrowed the search. Documented instances of individual or small unit combat engagements in which the human participants were confirmed to have continued fighting against statistically unsurvivable odds. She added a secondary filter. Cases in which the humans in question had been aware, before or during the engagement, that survival was unlikely or impossible. The archive returned 947,000 verified records. Silath stared at that number for a long time. She began reading. Not all of them, that would have taken years, but a sample pulled at random from different centuries, different continents, different conflicts. And the further she read, the quieter the library deck seemed to get. There was a man named Alvin York, who had in a single morning used a rifle and a small pistol to stop an enemy assault of over 130 soldiers, alone, after his unit was pinned down, and had brought back over 100 prisoners. The record listed his own account of the event and the confirmed after-action reports from both sides. The numbers matched. There was a unit called the Lost Battalion, cut off behind enemy lines, surrounded, outnumbered by a factor she did not want to calculate, ordered to hold position with no food and no water, and no reinforcement for 5 days. And they had held. Not because they were forced to, but because they had voted among themselves to hold, and held. There was a nurse named Mary Borden who had worked 12-hour shifts in a forward surgery station that was actively being shelled, for years, because the wounded kept coming, and no one else was close enough to help. She had written about it in a document the archive had flagged as a primary personal account, and the tone of the writing was not heroic. It was tired and clear and very specific, the way someone writes when they are simply trying to describe what they see, without making it larger than it is. Silath stopped reading and sat very still for a moment. Then she entered a new search, cross-referencing the same types of records against every other coalition member species in the archive. She wanted to see the comparison. She needed to see it. The comparison was not close. No other species, not the Kreth, not the Voss, not the Luminari, none of them had a documented pattern of voluntary self-sacrifice in combat that came anywhere near the human rate. Other species had heroes. Every species had heroes. But for every other species, those records were exceptional, singular, celebrated specifically because they were rare. For humans, the archive flagged them as statistically common across every era and every culture and every type of conflict. She pulled up the record for Thermopylae, the specific battle Sergeant Morrow had described, and found that the archive had a full verified entry. 300 Spartan soldiers, confirmed. The opposing force, confirmed. The duration of the engagement, confirmed. The outcome, confirmed. Every detail Morrow had described was there, exactly as she had said it, with primary source documentation attached. Silath sat back in her chair. She heard footsteps behind her. Her crewmate, Orendal, another Luminari, coming in for an early shift start. And she turned and looked at him, and said nothing. She simply gestured at the screen. He crossed the room, read what was on it, read some more, scrolled through the comparison data, and then straightened up and looked at Silath with an expression that matched exactly what she felt. Not amusement, not curiosity, but something quieter and considerably less comfortable than either. "How long have you been here?" he asked. "Since second bell," she said. He looked at the screen again. The number 947,000 sat there, still and patient, not going anywhere. "We laughed at them," he said. "Yes," she said. Neither of them said anything after that. They sat together in the small library room, with the archive glowing on the screen between them. And outside in the corridor, the ship hummed, and the crew moved through their routines, and the mission continued exactly as it always had. But something in the way both of them looked at the door had quietly and permanently changed. The common bay of Outpost Valar 9 smelled like recycled air and burned metal. It always did after a long shift. But tonight, it felt different. Tonight, it felt almost warm. The 5 species who shared the outpost had gathered in a loose circle near the heating vents, each one finding a spot that matched their comfort. The Kreth soldiers sat straight and still on the metal benches, their scaled spines rigid with the habit of military posture. The Voss sprawled wide, their 4 thick arms folded across their broad chests. The Luminari floated just above the floor on soft cushions of biolight, their pale forms glowing faintly blue. The Daki engineers clustered together near the wall, their antennae twitching with the low frequency of private communication. And the humans, 3 of them, sat at the far end of the bench nearest the door. Sergeant Yale Morrow sat with her back straight and her hands resting on her knees. She had dark eyes that moved slowly around the room and took everything in without appearing to look at anything. Corporal Danny Osei sat beside her, relaxed, one boot up on the bench, his expression easy and open. And Private Theo Kask sat last, youngest, quietest, watching everything with the wide attention of someone still new to space. The gathering had started as a tradition, something the Kreth commander Vrath San had introduced early in the mission. He had called it a cycle rest sharing, which was the Kreth military term for what most other species simply called sitting around and talking. The idea was simple. Each crew member would share a story from their world's history or culture, something that meant something to their people. It was meant to build understanding between species who had been assigned to work together for 18 months with no guarantee of liking each other. Vrath San himself sat at the head of the circle, tall, gray-scaled, with the kind of stillness that came from decades of command. His eyes were amber and sharp, and they moved across the group with the calm efficiency of someone who missed nothing. He had opened the evening with a Kreth battle memory, a story about the siege of the Twin Moons that was 300 years old and still taught in every Kreth military academy. It had been a good story, cold and precise and brutal in exactly the way Kreth stories tended to be. The Voss warrior Gumtar had followed with a tale of the great charge at Harova, where 10,000 Voss infantry had pushed through a chemical storm because their general had told them the wind would clear in an hour. It had not cleared for 6 hours, and 4,000 of them had died, but they had won, and that was the part Gumtar's voice went deep and proud over. Then it had been the humans' turn. Sergeant Morrow had pulled out her datapad without any ceremony. She had scrolled briefly, and then looked up at the group and said, in a voice that was calm and plain and completely without performance, "I will share some stories from our history, things our people still talk about and still remember. They are old, but they matter to us." Nobody had objected. She started with the story of 300 Spartan soldiers who had held a narrow mountain pass called Thermopylae. 300 men who had stood against an army of hundreds of thousands so that the rest of their people could have time to prepare. She told it simply, without drama, the way she might describe a troop movement on a map. Gumtar had interrupted first, his voice friendly, not hostile, but carrying the particular tone of someone who found something amusing. 300 against how many? Estimates range from 100,000 to over 2 million, depending on the source. The exact number is debated, but the outcome is not. The 300 held the pass for 3 days, and every one of them died there. There was a pause. Then the laughter started. Not cruel laughter, not quite, but the laughter of soldiers who had heard too many tall tales and knew exactly what exaggeration sounded like. Gumtar leaned toward the nearest Kreth soldier and said something in low Voss tongue that made the Kreth soldier's chest plates rumble with amusement. The Luminari exchanged glances that carried meaning too fast for any non-telepath to catch. Even one of the Daki engineers clicked its mandibles in what Morrow had learned was the insectoid equivalent of a dry chuckle. Vrath San did not laugh, but he did not stop the laughter either. He simply watched Morrow with those amber eyes, his expression unreadable. Morrow did not change her face. She waited for the amusement to settle, and then moved to the next story. A warrior queen named Boudica, who burned 3 Roman cities with a force they had told her was too small to fight. A soldier named Audie Murphy, who had climbed onto a burning tank destroyer in the middle of a battle and used its mounted gun alone to hold off an entire company of enemy soldiers, while wounded, while the vehicle burned beneath him, while everyone around him had pulled back. A group of paratroopers who had jumped into darkness behind enemy lines with broken radios and no support, and had fought for days on nothing but will and dirt and each other. Each story had drawn more laughter, more side conversations, more good-natured dismissal. The Voss thought the numbers were impossible. The Kreth thought the tactics were fiction. The Luminari found the emotional logic charming but unscientific. The Daki simply could not make the probability models work, and quietly said so to each other in cliques. Gumtar had finally held up 2 of his 4 hands in a gesture of entertained surrender, and said, "We understand, humans. Your people tell very exciting stories. Perhaps your ancestors were great writers." "Perhaps," Morrow said. She closed her datapad and set it on her knee. Osei looked at the floor. Kask looked at Morrow. Neither of them said anything. Vrath-San watched all 3 of them with an expression that nobody thought to read carefully, because the laughter in the room was still comfortable, and the evening was still warm, and the mission still had 16 months left to run. "Thank you, Sergeant," Vrath-San said, formally and correctly, in the way Kreth commanders always closed a sharing session. "Thank you for listening," Morrow replied, equally formal, equally correct. She picked up her datapad, nodded once at Osei and Kask, and the 3 humans left the common bay quietly and without hurry, the way people leave a room when they have decided not to show that something landed wrong. The laughter in the bay continued for a while after they were gone. Vrath-San did not join it. He sat very still at the head of the circle, with his amber eyes fixed on the empty space where the 3 humans had been sitting, and his expression was something that none of his crew would have recognized if they had been paying attention, which they were not. It was the expression of a soldier who had heard those stories before, not as stories, but as field reports, and who had never once, in 40 years of service, found a single thing in any of them worth laughing at.